Hello, welcome to ALM for you. My name is Jagmohan Chawla, and let's see how do we use release and deployment plan in SAP Cloud ALM. The first question that's obvious is, do I really need release management? So the point is, it depends. It depends on your use cases. The good news is it's optional. That means you don't have to even understand it, or you don't have to use it if you are not finding any problem, or if you have a specific working style. So it's optional. So then the question is, where can it help me, right? It can help you if you have multiple parallel projects, each with a different heartbeat. Then a release plan helps you set a common heartbeat. That's the kind of one of the main use cases of release management. But that's not the only use case. That means even if I have just one project, still I can find this beneficial if I want to organize my requirements around a timeline or my deployments around a timeline, and it gives me a common language to communicate with my stakeholders. So a release plan is really a simple schedule, a start date and an end date, and that's it. And where do I need it? I need it to plan specific events in my project, such as testing or deployment. And what are the properties of a release? So as I mentioned, it has a start date and an end date. I can create a release plan with overlapping dates. That means they don't have to be in a strict sequence, and that's very possible in case a multi-country rollout, maybe you want to model them as releases, but then they have overlap. That's reality, and that's possible with release management. The releases can be locked. So this is very interesting, in which you can say, I no longer accept scope for a release because my scope is final and I have to give it to testing. So you can lock a release for a specific purpose. What you need to be careful is release exists only under an entity called deployment plan. And then let's see what is a deployment plan. A deployment plan is nothing but a series of releases together. It's a release schedule. So deployment plan, you can say, is a higher level entity. And deployment plan also contains one additional thing, which is the system group assignment. So the deployment plan also contains your system groups. So that's really an important point. And how do we use a deployment plan? We use a deployment plan in a project. So once a deployment plan is assigned to a project, then it's called a deployment landscape, because then as a project lead, I know more or less the landscape which I can operate on. I also get the release schedule in my project, and that's why it becomes a deployment landscape. But let's not make it too theoretical. Let's actually go to the system. So the first question is, how do you even set a release or a deployment plan that we talked about? You have to click on the tile Projects and Setup. This style is a cross-purpose style because there are things that are specific to a project, but there are many cross-project entities, and deployment plan is a good example. To create a release, you have to access the deployment plan tab and create a deployment plan. Only within a deployment plan, you can create a release. So I have done that already. So I have my deployment plan called Acron Group Deployment Plan. And I'm using it in two projects which are running in parallel. And I assign the same deployment plan to those projects to make my life easier. So one project is about SAP S/4HANA Cloud, and one project is for SuccessFactors. Make sure you watch my video on system groups to know more about system groups. I'll keep it short here. This deployment plan has system groups already assigned, so my deployment plan knows the landscape. But what about the release? And this is where you create a release within a deployment plan. So I have already created two releases. I'm going to extend it by another release. So I create on the plus icon. Okay, so I have created my third release, and you can see I can delete a release, and I can use these lock icons, which I explain shortly. First, let me save it. So now once I assign this deployment plan to a project, then this release schedule becomes available to them. But how does this release schedule help? So release schedule, as I mentioned, help establish a common heartbeat. As an example, let's look at release 2. which is due on June 30th, or release 1, which is due on March 31st. So that means it's establish a key event, and maybe you want to have a common end-to-end integration test on 31st March. So make sure that SuccessFactors and the S/4HANA Cloud teams can talk to each other. So, but let's first of all go into each individual projects and see how the projects are doing. I can easily do that because I have my assigned projects in the deployment plan. I have done that already, so I can directly navigate to a project from a deployment plan. So I look at the first project for SAP S/4HANA Cloud, and I see that I have some time boxes. So each project lead is free to establish a timeline. In this case, there is a realize phase that ends on June 15th, and this team follows a monthly sprint schedule, and they have again a sprint 3 which is ending on March 31st. They also have some local milestones. Okay, so far so good. Then I come back because I want to actually navigate to the other project, SuccessFactors. And in my SuccessFactors project, I have different time boxing and a different sprint heartbeat. So in this case, it's not monthly sprint planning, but a flexible sprint planning, which is sometimes in 2 weeks, sometimes in 3 weeks, and they also have different milestones. So if I'm a release manager, this makes me nervous that I have 2 project leads and they have their own way of working, which I respect. One follows a monthly sprint schedule, but the other does not. And they also do the local planning. And I'm not getting confident that by my release 1, which ends on 31st March, will both teams be ready? Will both project teams be respecting the timelines which I have set for them? And this is where release management comes really handy. So what you can do is you can go to a tile on the Fiori Launchpad called Release and Timelines. This is released very recently. So this application actually tells you release and timelines for a deployment plan and the associated releases. So in this case, I have my deployment plan, and as I see, this deployment plan has 3 releases assigned, and maybe I want to focus only on the first deployment. So that means the first deployment for me is end of release 1. So I just focus on one release, and there I see that nothing has been assigned from a feature or requirement perspective. But that's also how a release manager is aware that our team assigning assets to this release. But that's the focus of a different video. Let's focus on the timelines. So here, the problem statement which I wanted to address is, as a release manager, do I feel confident that different projects are following a common heartbeat? And this is a very visual view, which brings that right easily, because I see that this is my release timeline, and I see that, okay, even though different projects are following a different sprint heartbeat, by 31st March, they have all planned to align nicely, and they have also scheduled some milestones. So this project has a milestone for test script completion by March 27th in preparation for the release, and this project is even way more advanced, in which they say by March 15th they will be finishing their test scripts, and that helps me establish that by 31st March we can have our first deployment end of release 1. That's the main use case of release management. So I can use it for planning key events, and then I can see that do my release dates nicely align with project sprints and time boxes. Now the question is release management relevant for me even if I'm using a single project? So there is one interesting use case in which maybe you want to keep things together for a multi-country rollout. You don't want to explode the number of projects, but you want to keep the timelines of each individual rollout different, because you want to assign features to a specific multi-country rollout. In that case, you can model the multi-country rollouts as releases, and that way you can assign features to those releases and manage your deployments even within a single project. So yes, it can be still relevant and interesting to you. Hope you enjoyed this information, and if you did, then please give a thumbs up, and please feel free to share this video in your networks. Stay tuned to the channel. Have a great day. Bye bye.